Hello everybody, my name is Kat and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things horror. And for this week's video, doing something a little bit different, since we are in a bit of a lull period between like the June movies and then the big releases that are coming out in July. I thought now would be the perfect time to catch up on some indie horror releases and give my thoughts on those. My original plan for this video was to actually go see I Saw the TV Glow. That's a film I've been wanting to catch for a while now. It was only playing at one theater near me, but unfortunately life just got in the way and I'm actually currently in the process of looking for a new place to live. So between meeting with realtors and going to see places, unfortunately I just missed the last few showings of I Saw the TV Glow. So I'm gonna have to wait for that to come out on streaming. In the meantime, I've been catching up on other indie horror releases. So I have about 4 that I'm going to be talking about today. They're not in any particular order. Well, technically that's a lie. I am talking about them in the order that I saw them, but they're not like ranked from like best to worst. I'm just going to give my general reactions to each of them. Also, you'll probably notice a slight change in the video. I have one more film that I want to watch and give my review on, but I'm not going to have time to do that until tonight. But I had time this afternoon to go ahead and film the other reviews. So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna like go ahead and film my thoughts on the 3 films that I've watched so far, and then I'll record my final thoughts on the last film probably tomorrow. Okay, so let's get into it. So the first film that I watched is Infested. This is a French film that you can now watch on Shudder. I went into this movie thinking it was something else. So Infested is a horror film about a spider infestation, and I had actually confused this movie with another spider horror film that came out, I think earlier this year. I believe that one is called Sting. I went into Infested thinking it was Sting, and I was very confused because what I saw of Sting, it seemed a bit more, I don't know, whimsical than what Infested is. Infested is much more dark and gritty. And then lo and behold, after the movie was over, I looked it up and realized that it was not the movie that I thought it was. But that's okay because I actually really enjoyed Infested. I liked it a lot more than what I originally thought I was going into it. Now I will say off the bat here, as far as like bugs go and like bugs in horror movies, yes, I am not a bug person by any means. That being said, out of all of the bugs that I am scared of, spiders are actually not one of them. I actually really love spiders. Spiders eat other bugs that I find more gross and annoying, like mosquitoes, for example. But even though I am not afraid of spiders, I did think that there were things within this film that were very effective and very creepy. There are some pretty creepy moments, especially when the spiders do start biting people, because then you get a little bit of body horror included as well. So this film begins with these like criminals going out into the desert and they're collecting these spiders with the intention of illegally bringing them into France and selling them on the black market. So there's a whole like theme or commentary here around like invasive species and this whole idea of people that like own and collect exotic animals or exotic pets, and how oftentimes while the idea of owning an exotic animal is cool in theory, that can actually be really destructive, not just for your home and yourself, but also the immediate environment that you're in as well. I live in South Florida, so we have a ton of invasive species around here, and yes, some of them can be very destructive to the local ecosystems. So I thought that was a very interesting commentary that this film was offering. This is a low-budget film, so most of it does take place within this apartment building that our main characters are living at, which works because I think it gives the film this very like claustrophobic feel that works to its benefit. You definitely have times where the characters are just like literally stuck and they have like nowhere to go, and the question is like, how are you going to get yourself out of this situation? So I think the location itself definitely adds to the tension and the suspense of the film. And then another thing that I think really worked to this film's benefit is the protagonist. Now when the film first started, I wasn't sure how to feel about the protagonist. He is this like career criminal. He does sell things on the black market to get money, but I think the film does a really great job of endearing you to him and letting you as the viewer understand like his predicament, his situation. He definitely has a strained relationship with his family. He lives with his sister in his deceased mother's apartment, and you can tell that he's still grieving over the death of his mother. And I think the thing that endeared me, at least to him the most, he does have his whole like collection of invasive species, and while it's not great, you can tell that he tries really hard to take care of them them in the best way that he can. He has a genuine love for these animals, and that is a love that developed all the way back in his childhood. and again very much connects to his family and his childhood friend that you also meet in the movie. So there's like this sweetness and this innocence to this character when it comes to him interacting with these animals, and that very much endears you to him as a viewer. He's even a protagonist that once these spiders start running around and causing a muck, like, he still cares for them. He's a character that realizes it's his actions that caused this predicament, right? Because the spiders are just kind of like doing what the spiders do, and they see the humans as threats, and so they are acting out against that threat to try to save themselves, which I liked. I personally thought that was like a really nice narrative touch that they did, and again really deepens the protagonist and really makes him a fully rounded character. On the topic of characters and narrative, I thought that this film has a way better story structure than most of the like mainstream Hollywood cinema that we've been getting lately. I feel like in a lot of the mainstream horror films that we've been getting, the narrative structures are just all over the place, where they will start off one way and then suddenly become something else, or there's just no structure at all. So at least this film had like the standard 3-act structure, right? It sets up things at the beginning, and then those things have like payoff at the end. That being said, I feel like the film was maybe like 15-20 minutes too long. The film runs at about an hour and 45 minutes. I feel like if they had like chopped it down to like an hour and 30 minutes and just kind of kept up the pace of it, because there are times when the film kind of slows down and gets into a little bit of like a lull period and doesn't really need to do that. But overall, I enjoyed the film. I enjoyed spending time with the characters. I thought this film also had a really interesting look to it. Like I said, it's kind of gray and gritty, but then it also utilizes like this neon lighting throughout that looks really cool as well. You can tell that the filmmakers like put some thought into how they wanted the film to look. And I'm just a sucker for eco horror. After slasher films, eco horror is my second favorite subgenre. I just love watching nature run amok and take down humans, especially when you also have a really good environmental message behind all of the craziness and carnage. So if you're into eco horror, or if you're into these kind of films, then I would definitely say check out Infested on Shudder. Okay, so next up is Baghead, which I also watched on Shudder. Now, I think technically this film came out in 2023, and it was a film that I remember reading about, and I wanted to see it, but none of the theaters in my area got it. So this was the first time that I got to see it, and well, just a disappointment, really. This film is about a young woman whose father passes away suddenly, and she inherits this pub that he owns. And it's kind of this like old Victorian pub. And so she gets there and then discovers that her father has this secret hidden in the basement of the pub. And what the secret is this evil demonic entity, who I believe was a witch in like the 18th century that got burned, because of course. And basically what happens is this demonic entity, if you go up to her and sit with her, she has the ability to transform into a loved one that passed away. And so then you can communicate with your deceased loved one. An interesting premise, very similar to Talk to Me, in the sense that you have this like spiritual entity that you can use to communicate with the dead. And like the rules of Talk to Me and Baghead are pretty much the same. It's this idea that yes, you can communicate with the dead for a certain amount of time. You have like 2 minutes to communicate, and then you have to let the connection go. If you don't let the connection go, the evil entity or the spirits that have passed on are going to be able to have control over the living. So a very similar premise, although I will say I think Talk to Me did this idea way better. I wasn't as crazy about that film as a lot of other people were, but that film in comparison to Baghead is like 1,000 times better. Talk to Me is so much more polished in terms of its narrative, its characters, its cinematography, just the atmosphere that it creates, its themes around grief and even addiction. I think the reason why Talk to Me worked a lot better than Baghead is because in Talk to Me, when the characters are conjuring the dead, right, the spirits are actually entering their bodies. They actually become possessed by the dead. So there's like this eeriness to it, and there's something about that feels much more vulnerable than what you get in Baghead, where it's like characters just come and like talk to this woman, but she's not like possessing the person she's talking to, right? She's not like infiltrating their body. So it feels like there's much more of a distance between the living and the dead here, and it just just doesn't feel as scary or as innovative as what you get with Talk to Me, which is also bringing in this new idea as well of like getting a high off of being possessed by these spirits. Like I feel like Talk to Me brought something new to this subgenre, whereas Baghead just kind of does things that we've seen before. I also feel like the protagonist in Talk to Me was a much more like fully rounded character, and you really get to understand her and really understand the grief that this character was going through. Like both of these films deal with grief and grieving, but I feel like Talk to Me actually like got us there, right? We could see with the protagonist, her struggling, the fact that like she doesn't want to be home because being home brings up all of these like bad memories for her. She tries to escape that in many ways. So we understand her psychology enough, and then it makes sense once she starts communicating with the dead, and once she does have that contact with her deceased mother, we understand like why she wants to keep using the spiritual tool to communicate with the dead, even though the more that she does it, the more dangerous it gets. Whereas in Baghead, the protagonist is just kind of this nothing character. She's one of those characters that just has the same like one note throughout the entire film. And her switch from like being, you know, somewhat normal to then being overcome by this demonic entity and being like obsessed with this entity's powers, that switch happens like so fast. But again, she doesn't really like change her demeanor that much throughout the whole movie. So it's like you're relying on other characters to come in and tell us, the audience, that the protagonist has changed and she's becoming more like possessed as the movie goes on. And it's just not as effective. Like in Talk to Me, we got to see that change happening. In Baghead, we're being told that the change is happening. In Baghead, there are other characters that are like coming in. There's like this random dude who is obsessed with the lady in the basement because he wants to talk to his wife who passed away, and he's just like hanging around creepily all the time. And then there's like the, I think, best friend of the protagonist, or maybe her girlfriend. I don't really know. There's definitely a close relationship between these two, but again, that's something that like the movie's just kind of telling us. We don't really see a lot of intimacy between these two characters. And yeah, the acting here is not like great. Like again, the protagonist, and as always I forget these people's names, but like she just has the same reaction to everything in the film. Like when she's down in the basement and she witnesses the Baghead lady for the first time, like this demonic entity is coming towards her and her response is just like, oh, get away from me. And I was like, okay. It's hard to feel scared of something when your main characters are just like standing around and looking bored. So yeah, a lot of exposition dialogue, a lot of things get explained just through characters yapping. It's just not interesting to watch, which is kind of a bummer because I feel like this could be an interesting premise. I felt like they needed to lean more into like the folklore aspect of it, or maybe the like gothic nature of it. I was talking to a friend the other night and we were trying to think of recent examples of horror films that actually have like a real cinematic feel to them. And what I mean by cinematic feel, I mean not just story, but also the way that it looks, right? The way that the film is able to create this atmosphere, able to create an immersive environment that lets you, the viewer, really engage with the story and engage in the world that these characters live in. And I feel like you see a lot of really great examples of that in like the 1970s, like paranormal films. If you look at things like the original Omen or Rosemary's Baby or Amityville Horror, like any of these films from the 1970s, they all managed to create this like sense of grandness and epicness within the frame. And a lot of that had to do with just the way that the films were shot, right? Using the kind of like wide angle lens. Or even if you have like a film like a Rosemary's Baby or The Exorcist, which is primarily taking place within like an interior location, even those films felt like bigger than what we get today. And I think a lot of that has to do with, yes, both the aesthetics of it, but also like the story and the psychology behind the characters and like what's happening. If you look at any of these films, like they have very rich characters. And so even if the stories don't feel grand in terms of location, they feel grand in terms of character psychology and like the inner journeys and turmoils that these characters are having to deal with. And that's what gives it like this pure cinematic quality, right? It is both intention in the writing and in the characters, and intention in how everything everything is filmed and shot. Baghead just felt like any run-of-the-mill movie that you're gonna find on streaming. Like, there was nothing special about its visuals. There's nothing special about the demon. There was nothing special about the characters. And I really struggled to get through it. I found myself getting distracted in a lot of parts. And I'll be straight up with you all, I gave this film an hour and 10 minutes. I skipped through like the last 20 minutes of this thing. They present something interesting at the end, but I don't think it's worth waiting an hour and 20 minutes to get to that point. I was also thinking from like the premise of it, because the way that it sounds in like the description, it almost sounded like it might be a thing where you're having like multiple characters come and talking to this like Baghead lady. I was thinking it might have been interesting if you were to set this film up as like an anthology, right? Where you're having like all these people coming in, and then that's a way to get into all these different stories that you could explore, right? Something along the lines of Trilogy of Terror or The House That Dripped Blood. That's a completely different premise than what they're presenting here. I will say this film actually has pretty good reviews on Shudder. Like, a lot of people are giving this 4 out of 5 stars. I don't know, maybe I was just like too tired when I watched it. I would say if it's a premise that sounds somewhat interesting to you, maybe give it a shot. I feel like this is one of those movies where you'll know within like the first 10 to 15 minutes if it's going to be something that you enjoy the whole way through. Okay, moving on to the third film. So the third film that I watched is Mind, Body, and Spirit. This is a found footage movie about a wannabe yoga instructor, a wannabe yoga influencer. This is a film that I have been looking out for because I was pretty interested in the premise of it. And you can watch it now on Amazon Prime. You are gonna have to pay for it. I rented the film for like $3, but I'm sure it'll come to like a Hulu or a Netflix or something eventually. So honestly, I actually liked this film. I don't think it's perfect. It's not a horror film that's like, oh my God, drop everything and go watch this right now. And the other thing is that if you are not a fan of the found footage subgenre, this is not a film that's going to convince you otherwise. And it suffers from a lot of problems that most found footage movies do, namely the whole thing of like, you know, you have a character whose life is in danger, and the number one question is, why the hell are you still filming this? So suspension of disbelief is required here, but if you typically enjoy these kind of found footage movies, then you'll probably like this one too. As I said, this follows a young woman whose grandmother has just passed away, and she has inherited her grandmother's house out in Los Angeles. So she goes out there and lives in her grandmother's home. She never got to meet her grandmother really, or have a established relationship with her grandmother. So the young yoga instructor comes in, and it's through being in her grandmother's house that she's able to learn more about the kind of person that her grandmother was. And it turns out that the kind of person her grandmother was is someone that was into all of this weird demonic witchy stuff, because of course she is. But the yoga instructor goes to the grandmother's house and then basically sees it as a calling for her to get a jump start on this like YouTube series channel that she wants to create, which is called Mind, Body, Spirit, and is all about like yoga and meditation and again becoming one with your like body and your spirit. And then as this is happening, of course, you have the spirit of the evil demonic grandmother and essentially possessing her granddaughter. So, you know, like the evil grandmother who was a witch thing, we've been there, done that. This gives off big Hereditary vibes. But what I liked about it is that I felt like I could like personally relate to the protagonist in many ways. Obviously, I like this because it's a horror film, but I also thought it was funny as someone that has done yoga for a good chunk of their life. I do enjoy yoga, and I definitely do follow the like yoga with Adriene channels that it feels like this film is kind of poking fun at. And then I can also obviously connect with the protagonist in terms of just like trying to start a YouTube channel and like putting yourself on camera and how weird that experience can be. There were just a lot of things in here that I could personally relate to, and that definitely helped my enjoyment of the film. And as someone that does enjoy yoga, there is always this like trying to navigate between like the actual practice and the benefits that you can get from the actual practice with the very toxic wellness culture and wellness industry that we have. And the toxicness of that industry is something that this film is commenting on. It's something that this film is poking fun at. This movie definitely has a sense of humor to it. Throughout the film, there are these like ad breaks that are basically these like spoof commercials that you will see on like YouTube of people promoting their like, you know, fitness workout regimen or their new like dietary supplements that they're using. So it is definitely using both comedy and horror to just comment on the ridiculousness of the wellness industry and how oftentimes within Western cultures, people within the wellness industry will often take practices or methods from Eastern cultures and then just like turn them into these commodities without having any like real respect for like the actual ancient traditions that these practices come from. So the film is also offering a commentary on that. At times it's a bit on the nose, as well as, you know, the pressures of trying to have an online presence or this like toxic idea of wanting to be like an influencer. So I did think that the film was offering these interesting commentaries about both like our online culture. I do think it could have gone a little bit deeper with its messaging because the commentary that it does give is a little like superficial. It's kind of like, yeah, we know these things are toxic. You can tell this is a very low budget movie, and so you're pretty much confined to just this one like house location. And it also limits like how far the film can go in terms of its scary moments or in terms of the gore. From some of the like promotional material and descriptions of this film, I was going into it expecting like a little bit more body horror. Like we were gonna see more of her body kind of dysmorphing and becoming disfigured, but that doesn't really happen. I think there are effective moments in this film. I think there is certain framing that is very creepy, but I do think the problem that this film has is, again, it's very limited by its budget, and so it tends to rely on the same scares again and again. And I feel like using found footage as a framing device really limited the filmmakers as well, because there were times where they were just kind of playing fast and loose with the rules of like a found footage movie. Like there's one scene where our protagonist is hallucinating. She's like on the floor. And so you see her like on the floor kind of in this like trance state. But then you also see like different versions of her in the background. You see like all these multiple versions of her kind of walking throughout the house, and she's just increasingly getting more manic. And I was watching it and I was like, okay, one, I feel like had this not been a found footage movie, had this just kind of been a regular film, you really could have dived deeper into her psychology as a character, and you really, I think, could have done some wild stuff with these like hallucination scenes that she has. And I think that could have been like really effective and added a variety of, you know, like creepy or disturbing scenes. So that's one thing. But then my other thing when I was watching it was like, is this a hallucination? Because if it is a hallucination, like how is the camera picking that up? And if it's not a hallucination and there are actually like multiple versions of this character now running throughout the house, like how is that possible? So there were moments like that where it felt like the premise of the film like fell apart a little bit for me. And again, I feel like if they had not limited themselves to like the found footage thing, they could have done a lot more with the story and with this concept. I also found it strange that for someone that wants to become a YouTuber and make these kind of videos, she never looks at her footage. Like there's all this kind of like creepy stuff happening that she never sees and is oblivious to because she doesn't actually watch the footage. I mean, they do kind of set up like she's kind of avoiding editing stuff and actually uploading it to her channel, but I feel like they could have done something interesting with like the whole editing process. Like maybe if they had shown a scene where she was like trying to edit something together, because honestly, having to watch yourself and edit yourself can like bring up all kinds of weird self-conscious, self-esteem stuff. It's a very like strange thing to go through, and I felt like it would have been interesting had the filmmakers maybe shown us that and shown her struggling with that, because again, I think that would have added to the fact that this is someone that does have a lot of low self-esteem, and that's what makes her the perfect target for this demonic entity to come in and possess her. So overall, this is not a perfect film by any means. Again, I enjoyed it just because of the kind of personal connections that I could make to it. So this is another one where I would say if it seems like the premise is interesting enough to you, check it out. This is another movie that you are going to know within the first few minutes whether or not you're going to like it, or if you know that found footage is not your thing, then I would probably say like just skip this one. Okay, and now it is the next day. It is very early in the morning, hence why the lighting is now different. So I watched one more movie last night. I fit one more in, and that is Lovely, Dark, and Deep. Now this is streaming for free right now on Tubi, and it's pretty short. It's only like an hour and 27 minutes, and it follows this young camp ranger. She's reporting to work for the summer, right, to kind of be out patrolling the forest, help anyone that needs assistance. And you do learn that she has been a park ranger before. There's some sort of like mysterious event that happened in her past, right? People kind of look at her and kind of say like, oh, that's like the crazy one right there. And you also learn that she has some sort of like weird connection to the forest, and she has some sort of past trauma connected to the forest. And basically what that trauma is you find out her sister went missing one day in the woods and they were never able to find her. And then what you learn throughout the film is that this specific woods that the rangers are in has some sort of haunting going on, or some sort of like cosmic horror entity that comes and takes people away. People just go missing in this forest and they're never seen again. The film stars Georgina Campbell, who of course we know from Barbarian, and she was just in that Watchers movie last week. And I think she's great. I think she's a great actress. It's nice seeing her in all of these horror films. She's kind of becoming one of our modern day scream queens. I feel like somebody needs to talk to her agent to get her better projects, because she is so much better than a lot of these like mediocre horror films that she's been popping up in lately. And this film, you know, it did have an interesting premise, and I applaud it for wanting to do something different and for showing us something that we don't really see a lot in film. This whole idea of being a park ranger and what that actually entails. Like, I don't know what that world is. And there were certainly moments of it that were really interesting, and I was really engaged in like where the story was going. But then there were a lot of other moments that everything just felt kind of bland. Like, it would go from being super interesting to like super not interesting within the span of a couple of scenes. I would say for like the first 45 minutes, not a lot happens in this movie. It's just a lot of scenes of Georgina Campbell like walking around the woods, and there's a lot of very, you know, beautiful nature shots. But yeah, it's just her kind of walking around, and you could make the argument like, well, this is a slow burn horror film. The thing is that even with slow burn horror, you're usually learning something about the characters, or you're learning something about the world that the film is taking place in. Whereas I feel like with this film, like, we don't really learn that much about her character. Like, yes, there's like some flashbacks where we learn about her family and the whole disappearance of her sister, but like, I don't know how that actually impacted her as a character. Like, they kind of set up that she's been on this mission to find her sister, and that is maybe the reason why she became a park ranger to begin with. But I don't know, the film's not giving us any of that information. So it just feels like a lot of scenes of watching her walking around in the woods, but we're not really learning anything. So that's why I'm hesitant to say that this is a slow burn. And this is trying to have a Lovecraftian, again, that cosmic horror feel, where you're not actually seeing whatever this entity is that is in the woods and is kidnapping people. And I think that's fine. Like, I don't think you really need to show the entity, especially, again, if you are wanting to take a more like cosmic route. But again, I just don't feel like there's much here in terms of the story and like the themes that really like pushes that sense of like cosmic horror. Like, when I think of cosmic horror, I think of like dread, right? You know, or just as like all-consuming like anxiety, or a lot of like nihilism. And I just didn't get a lot of that from this movie. Again, I feel like the first half, a lot of it was just Georgina Campbell walking around the woods. And then the second half, it does get a little bit more interesting. It does get a little bit more, I guess, experimental, you could call it. Her character kind of ends up in this weird like time warp place within the woods, and so all the rules of reality are just being like broken, and it does take on, again, this much more experimental feel. But even all the experimental stuff, it's like the filmmakers are kind of borrowing things that they saw from like, you know, other surreal properties. There's a lot of like David Lynch Twin Peaks moments in here, and I feel like I've been saying this a lot lately, but again, like, it's not enough to just take something from somewhere else. Like, yes, it's fine to have inspiration, and it's fine to want to do like homages to something, but if you're gonna do it and put it in your own film and your own story, like, there needs to be a reason for it. There needs to be an intention behind it. It does need to connect to, again, whatever the story is that you're trying to tell. Because when you just kind of take these things and then throw them in like randomly, like, oh, here's like a moment from Twin Peaks where the characters are like talking, but it's all coming out in like backwards, and like, you know, that thing in Twin Peaks when they're in like the red room and everyone's talking, but it's like in that weird backwards sounding tone. Like, they try to do that in this film, in Lovely, Dark and Deep. And because it's not something that's really like set up in the film, and again, it's not like the film is keeping this very like surreal experimental tone throughout the whole thing. So again, I feel like the filmmakers are throwing in all these things that they've seen from other experimental films, but like, it's not integrated seamlessly into the film itself or the scenes, right? It just feels kind of jarring. It's just kind of like, okay, yes, I see that you're trying to do like a Twin Peaks thing here, but I don't think you really earned that moment. And I guess you could make the argument of like, well, again, it's supposed to be cosmic horror, it's supposed to be experimental, so like you just didn't get it. And maybe that's true, maybe I didn't get it. But there were just a lot of things in this film that to me felt like filler, and to me was kind of like a red flag. Like there are several shots and moments where they're just showing you like the same image. Like there's this image of like a tree. It's like Georgina Campbell's character, you're in her point of view and she's looking up at like the trees, and so you see like the tree branches, and this is supposed to be a memory, I guess, of the day that her sister got lost. But they show this shot of the tree so many times in this film, and it's the same shot, and very rarely do they give you any kind of like new information when they're showing you this. Like you could make a drinking game out of how many times they show the shot of this tree. And yes, I get that it's supposed to be signifying like, oh, her memory and her past trauma and like all of this stuff, but it's like to just keep showing it and then not present anything new with it, like it just feels like it's filler. There are a lot of shots in here that feel like it's just kind of filler, right? Again, the nature is beautiful, but like what are you trying to tell me about those shots? Like I understand if you want to like show it just to have an establishing shot, but to just have all these kind of like montages and like drone shots, that's another red flag for me, especially with these like indie horror films. It's just the overuse of drone shots, and again, using drone shots as a way to kind of fill out the minutes of a film. Here's the thing, like as a filmmaker, you only have a certain amount of time to tell a story, right? Usually you have about 90 minutes, maybe 100 minutes. And it may seem like a lot of time, but like it's really not. Like every second of a film, this is gonna sound super pretentious to say, but I think it's true that like every second of a film, it matters, right? And you should be using all of the time that you have to, again, either progress the story forward, progress the themes forward, or to develop your character. So when I see films and they just kind of have these throwaway shots and like these long montages of, yes, nature or drone footage, like to me that's always a red flag, because it's like, okay, it feels like you're just kind of putting in filler here, like that's time you could have used to develop your story. Another red flag that this film also does is when it starts off with a very pretentious quote. 9 times out of 10, the film itself rarely lives up to whatever deep meaning the quote is trying to convey. And again, it's disappointing because I do feel like the ending and kind of where they conclude the film at, like that could have been really unsettling had they done a better job at just kind of setting up the story and the character and the themes earlier in the film. What is the message here that I'm supposed to be getting from all of this? I think I might know, but also like I don't. I saw a comment online about this film that I actually agree with, and it was someone saying that this premise would have made like a really interesting 30-minute Twilight Zone or Outer Limits type episode. And I kind of agree with that. Like if this had been something within an anthology and just really focused on the more experimental aspects of this film, I think that could have worked really well, because it felt like the filmmakers were really more interested in this kind of cosmic experimental world. It felt like the first 40 minutes they were like, okay, we're just like throwing this in here so that we can stretch this movie out to be an hour and a half. But you can tell a lot of the creativity was spent more in the second half of the film. This is another one that, as far as reviews online go, there are people out there that certainly enjoyed this movie more than I did. So with the other films, I'll say if it sounds like something that's interesting to you, give it a shot. Again, it's free to watch on Tubi. You do have to sit through ads, which is kind of annoying. I know I'm kind of like wishy-washy on a lot of these films, but it's only because they're readily available on streaming. If these were films that were playing in the theater, then yes, I would be saying like, don't waste your money on them. But if you have time to kill, if you just need something on in the background and you want to see something new, then sure, give any of these films a shot, see what you think. All right, so that is all the films that I've been watching on streaming lately. Again, I think probably the best one was Infested. Overall, you know, the stuff on streaming isn't any better or worse than what we're getting in mainstream cinema, So as far as what's coming up next, I know A Quiet Place Day 1 is coming out at the end of June, but I'm going to be honest, I don't know if I'm going to be seeing that one or doing a review for it. I haven't really made up my mind yet, but I've said this before in other videos. I am just not the biggest fan of A Quiet Place. I don't think they're bad movies. I think they are very well made. They obviously get a lot of really great actors to star in them. Like they're fine. They're good movies. movies, they're just not the kind of film that I usually enjoy. I've said it before, I'm not really into the whole like creature effects and designs. And I see the previews for A Quiet Place day one, and yeah, it just kind of looks like the other films, and so I'm just like, I just don't know if I'm going to be able to contribute anything meaningful to the discussion around that film. So I think I might take a break and figure out my whole housing situation. If you would like to keep up with me and just my horror thoughts, I do have a Instagram page. I'll leave my handle in the description below. And there I mostly just like post about horror films that I like and just talk about like classic films that I enjoy. So if you're into that, you can follow me there. And then I do have a collaboration coming at the end of the month with some other horror creators. So I'm very excited about that. And then yeah, I will be back in July for Maxxxine and Longlegs, which I'm so excited for both of these films. I can't wait. But in the meantime, let me know your thoughts on the films that I've talked about here. Have you seen any of these films? What were your thoughts on them? Is there any like cool indie horror title that's on streaming right now that I missed? Let me know all of this in the comments down below, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much for watching.